Coming up on the Purposeful podcast.
Hey, here is a great idea when you talk about money and spending. One of the best ways the average everyday person like you and myself and our listening audience can do if you really want to return for your money, and not many people talk about this, but we can make a huge change if we buy stuff we consume regularly in bulk.
Welcome to this episode of the Purposeful podcast. I'm Matt.
I am Saki.
We're very happy to have you with us. On this episode, we are going to talk about tightening money markets, what higher interest rates and less cash is going to mean for you, whether individually or if you run a business. But before we get into that, man, how's your week been?
My week has been good. I've enjoyed it. The real estate business is still hot right now. The weather's warming up a little bit, so activity level usually goes up when that happens. How about yourself?
You ain't kidding. It's been nice outside.
Yeah,
It's
it
like
has.
68 today. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I think sunny and 75 is just about perfect, but 68 is not bad because you could just get out, do what you want to do. You don't even break a sweat.
Exactly.
It's lovely. But yeah, I've been good, man. Busy, but
Good. Good.
beats the alternative, right?
Yeah, I'll take busy over not busy any day of the week.
If you're not busy, you wish you were,
There you go.
at least if you're like we are, right? But
Exactly.
anyway, well, like we said, we're going to talk about tightening money markets this episode. And before we do that, we're going to kick it out to the intro.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios.
All right, brother. So tightening money, higher interest rates, less cash in the economy. What does this mean to us? That's kind of what we're going to explore. So let's start first with this this trend right now that cash is a bad place to be. To what extent is that true?
Yeah, so I think that's one of them questions that you'll get a different answer from everybody you talk to, I believe.
Sure.
You know, it really you'll notice the differences between people, whether they're conservative on their finance side or a little bit more um, liberal, to use two terms out of the political arena, but a little bit more liberal with their money or a little bit more conservative with their finances. To me, it, I guess the best way for me to say it is you really have to pay a little bit more attention in times like these that we're in to how much cash you're carrying and what you're doing with your investments. We're in a very volatile market. Inflation sky high, highest on record, I think, for 40 years or something like that. And we just don't know when that's going to stop.
Right.
So you've got to decide how much cash is enough cash. A lot of people out there are telling everyone to use up all their cash so it doesn't lose value. I'm not really under that mindset. I want to make sure all of our listeners understand that we still recommend they have their 6 months living expenses covered. And outside of that, I'm okay with using all that cash and deploying it into viable investments. But I would definitely not get rid of your emergency savings or 6 month living expenses.
All right. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail, because I saw an article today that we're looking at the inflation report for January is coming out at the end of the week. And right now, the expectation is that year over year inflation is supposed to come in somewhere around 7.3%. We'll see if it's that number or somewhere near, but it's been near 7% for a couple of months running now. And so that's causing people to sweat, because what that means is that if you have that cash that you're talking about sitting in an account that's basically not an interest-bearing account, then you're losing 7% of the value of that cash every year, the way things are going right now. So that's not a pleasant place to be. But then one of the fundamentals of a disciplined financial strategy, especially on the individual side, is to have a rainy day fund, right? So it seems like those two things are in a little bit of conflict. So if I'm sweating having that cash laying around in a checking account or something like that, why should I still do it?
Well, 7% sounds like a lot. But let's say that stays that way, which is a record level for the next 12 months. And let's just say your 6 months living expenses is $50,000 is what you have there, just for conversation purposes. A year from now, if inflation were to stay at 7%, 12 months from now, you would have lost what, $3,500 if my quick math is right,
of spending power.
So theoretically you'd have, $46,500 plus whatever little interest you made, which I don't recommend. That's in a risky account, so you're not going to get anything. It'll be negligible. But the reason people should keep it is we just don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball. So we don't know what's going to happen 12 months from now. And yes, everyone out there pretty much knows that the job market is very hot. Everybody's hiring. Very little people are worried about losing their job. Wages are going up. So I get it. So some people might think, oh, okay, well, we don't need that. We feel secure in our job. No, there's really no such thing as job security. And if 3 months from now, you could end up just being unnecessary. I mean, your company could decide they're replacing your position with an automated, robot or AI, or they could decide they just don't need the position anymore. So
Right.
You just don't know what's going to come up. And I will say this, when we talk about risk reward a lot. So yes, you have the potential to lose 7% on the money, but flip that around. And what's the potential that could happen to you if you use that money and you don't have access to it when you need it? I think we could probably all agree that would easily be more than 7%.
That's one of the keys, I think, when you consider why you would even have cash to begin with. It's really a combination of two things: liquidity and relative stability. Now, obviously, losing 7% value annually is not super stable, but someone might make the argument, well, I should be in crypto because it's just as liquid, right? I can get in and out of that very easily. So why not get into crypto instead of holding cash? Well, the answer is that right now, crypto is still relatively volatile. And there are significant ups and downs with crypto. And you may be in a situation where, you could see a 7% swing in a matter of hours, let alone, annually. But that can be a benefit, that can be a disadvantage. But when you're talking about volatility, the timing matters. If you need that money right now, and it just so happens that crypto is on, like a down week and you're down 20%, which can happen in a week, then you've lost a significant amount of the spending power of what you have invested in that. So, cash is still relatively more stable. And you're not talking about putting your entire, value of all of your possessions into cash, but you're still keeping enough of what you have liquid so that it's there if you need it. Life happens. You talked about, potentially losing a job. People get sick, unfortunately. One of the things that's happened a lot with COVID is people didn't get the checkups that they needed, right? They were afraid to go get their cancer screenings. They were afraid to go get their physicals over the course of the last 2 years or so. It's not as much the case now as it was, but a lot of people missed those routine screenings. And a lot of what we've seen now is that you've got increased rates in terms of things like cancer because those things were missed. And if you find yourself in that position, and Lord willing, you won't, but it is happening to people. And if you're in that position and you find yourself out of work because you're going to be undergoing significant medical treatments over the next, 3 to 6 months, having that liquidity available to you is important. That's going to be the difference between being able really to devote all of your attention to getting well, or having this, thundercloud hanging over your head, causing you anxiety about how are you going to make everything meet. And even if you've got the assets and other investments, again, gets back to the same point with crypto. I mean, if you're in the stock market and you look at where things ended December 21 versus January of 22, you probably saw some down the month of January. So if now all of a sudden that's where your assets are, that's where your emergency fund is, and you need to pull that 50,000 out of the stock market, it's going to have cost you more than 7%. And I think that's really the point.
Yeah, definitely. So let's say, and my time period might be a little bit off, but let's say someone who had their rainy day fund and their 6 months living expenses, and they decided to put it in crypto. Well, let's remember there's a 1.5% give or take transaction fee, depending which crypto and what platform you're on, every time you do something. So if you go to buy that crypto, there's roughly 1.5%. Then if you go to transfer that crypto to an offline wallet, software wallet, wherever, because you don't want to leave it in that exchange, well, there's another percent or 1.5%. Well, then to sell it, you got to transfer it back at that point. And then so you might be looking at 6% right there. But, Bitcoin, for example, back in September, if somebody said, I feel so secure with my job, I'm not worried at all, I'm going to take my 6 months living expenses, I'm going to put it in Bitcoin. Well, it was $65,000, give or take. Well, let's say in January, they lost their job for whatever reason. Let's say they got hurt, car accident. There's so many things that life can throw at you that we don't know they're coming. That's kind of the point, right? So let's say that happened, and come January, they need that money now. Well, they just lost, what is that, 30%, 25%?
Maybe more. Where is Bitcoin right now? Do you know off the top of your head?
It did well today. I think it's around 44,000 right now. So you're talking what, a 21,000 decline? Is that 33% or something like that?
You're in the ballpark of between 30 and 40% somewhere.
So that trumps the 7% we're worried about because of a little inflation, and we don't even know if that's going to happen. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, that should pretty much just nip that in the bud. Everybody needs to keep their 6 months expenses keep it in a money market or just a regular savings account. Money market with your local bank or national bank, it'll get you a little bit of a better rate. You still have access to it, but it's just not at risk. And that's what we recommend.
Exactly. Well, let's look at this as it relates now. I mean, let's say everybody buys into what we just said, and they're like, all right, we're still going to keep our 6-month rainy day fund in cash. But now what do I do with everything else? I'm looking at the prospect of borrowing costs going up because the Federal Reserve, I think, has pledged that they're going to make at least 3 or 4 rate increases in 2022. And then you've got inflation is still, really hot right now. So there's incentive, you could argue, there's a strong incentive to act right now, because if you don't, there's a reasonably good expectation that the borrowing costs are going to be higher if you're looking at borrowing to fund something, like a real estate purchase, or costs are going to continue to rise. So even if the borrowing costs didn't go up, you're going to get less bang for your buck 6 or 12 months from now. That's what you're going to be hearing. That's the logic. That's what you're going to be thinking. So is that sound in your opinion? Or is there something else there that we need to think about before we start making those kinds of decisions?
Well, to answer that question, we have to first back up a little bit and find out, and everyone needs to ask themselves this question. One, am I going to make this large purchase anyway? In the next 12 months, do I expect myself or my family to buy this property, to buy a new car, to get investment real estate? Are we expecting to do that? If the answer to that is yes, then I would answer your question with yes, now's the time to do it, if you're going to make a move in the next 12 months. Now, keep in mind, it's all about your percentages personally, right? I mean, if you're looking to buy a house right now to homestead, to live in, and that house mortgage would be 40% of your income, well, I don't think you're ready. And there's really no sense in even talking about what it's going to be 12 months from now, because you're just not ready. You can't tie up that much of your income to your house because it just doesn't leave enough for everything else. So if you run the numbers and you're at 30%, which is the highest I recommend, then okay, cool. Let's go buy that house right now, because I do think throughout 2022, I do think there is a good chance I'm not going to say it will, but I'm going to say it looks like there's a good chance interest rates will be higher and prices will not have come down yet. And they would not have reached that equilibrium between the two.
Right. So you are in a position then where, based on reasonable expectations, what you can get for $1 now is going to be higher value than what you can get for $1 a year from now, most likely. And borrowing $1 today is going to be cheaper than borrowing $1 12 months from now, most likely. So I guess, we're still analyzing this, I think, from the personal finance perspective. What would you steer clear of? What would you be leery of in terms of borrowing or in terms of spending?
So when it comes to borrowing, I would be very leery of over leveraging or borrowing, financing property that has an adjustable rate on the interest. And we've seen they've kind of crept back a little bit into favor over the past couple of years with the low rates, and property values going higher. Sometimes people can't afford it, so they're pushing the limits a little bit. Doesn't seem to be as big as an issue as it was 13 years ago, but time will tell. So don't do anything with an adjustable rate. Make sure you get it fixed and lock that rate down for the 15-year period if you're buying a home, and make sure when it comes to you spending, hey, here is a great idea when you talk about money and spending. One of the best ways the average everyday person like you and myself and our listening audience can do, if you really want a return for your money, and not many people talk about this, but we can make a huge change if we buy stuff we consume regularly in bulk. And now you got to be careful with that. I'm not talking about the printer ink for the printer you have. Yeah, I mean, get a couple extra cartridges maybe, but the printer might go bad and break, and as cheap as they are these days, you get another printer and it might not be the same ink. But if you use a certain shampoo, if you use a certain trash bag, if you use a certain item around your house for your family that you know you're going to use, I mean, you're unless you plan on not showering 6 months from now, you're going to need shampoo or body wash or soap or something. So I highly recommend, especially if you see these products come on sale, because they do, I'd buy them in bulk, and you can actually see a tremendous savings by doing that over a 6-month period.
That's an excellent point. One of the things, as you were talking, my mind is kind of wandering a little bit to topics that are related. And I was thinking, okay, well, let's bring this back to the big three. Most people spend most of their money on housing, transportation, and groceries. So you're hitting the grocery thing hard right now, and that's a great point. I mean, now might be a good time to consider getting involved with one of those bulk buying outlet stores, right? Like Sam's or BJ's or Costco or something like that. Because if you can buy things like toilet paper and paper towels, and those things are not really going to be less useful 6 months from now than they are today, right? So it's like you talked about shampoo. There's a lot of what we buy that we can buy larger quantities, and they're going to be just as good 6 months from now as they are today, but they're probably a lot less expensive today than they will be in 6 months. So exactly. That's a good way to do it. We've talked to a certain extent about housing. What about automobiles? What about transportation?
So automobiles, the same would apply to that. If you know you're going to need an automobile in the next 12 months, I'd go ahead and start shopping now and get familiar with the process, get familiar with the price range you're going to be looking at. It's going to be easy to overspend. Just don't pay attention. Just, everybody wants the new fancy bells and whistles. But an interesting side note when it comes to transportation and automotive, you spoke about the big box clubs and buying in bulk. Kind of another benefit of them is they typically sell gas. Don't know if many people pay attention to that, but I'm a member, just full disclosure, I'm a member and have been for years of a local big box club we have here. Well, it's a national company, but anyway. And a lot of people don't realize that gas is 15 to 25 cents cheaper per gallon. And that adds up and more than pays for the membership cost. And so I highly recommend if you have a family of 4 or more, there's certain items that you need in bulk. I highly recommend a big box club, because that's going to help you on the automotive side too. It's going to cut your gas bill down.
Yeah. Well, those things matter, because one of the things that we don't often think about is that 7% inflation is kind of an aggregated computation, and it's weighted for some things and so on and so forth. But not everything is actually inflating at the same rate. And so one thing that you've seen is that the cost of gasoline over the last 12 months is way more than 7% up, right? And there are quite a few things that you buy at the grocery store that are way over 7% year over year. Meat, for example, pretty much any meat you would purchase, whether it's beef or pork or turkey or chicken or any of it, let alone seafood, right? So um, those are the kind of things where if you can buy those now, um, and hold on to grocery items over the long haul, that is a way to start saving. And another thing, unfortunately, you're going to have to think about is, cutting back on eating out and things like that. I know my wife and I used to be a lot more willing to just go out when we felt like it. Um, we're pretty much down to like once or twice a week, that we have set aside. And part of it, is for health reasons, but it's a little easier to do that, honestly, when you know that you're saving a substantial amount of money. I mean, sure. My wife and my mother-in-law and I went out to a seafood place nearby last week, and just for the three of us for lunch, you throw the tip in there, it was like about $70.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a lot of money,
Yeah.
for just the two of us. Our grocery bill is not even twice that every week. And it's a little easier to say no. And that's unfortunate, because it obviously does resonate in the economy. People aren't getting as many tips and things like that. But you got to think about positioning yourself for what's coming. And we know that when the economy is facing some tough headwinds, which it's likely, I mean, you never know 100% sure what's coming, but it's reasonable to forecast that interest rates are going to go up. One of the other things that the Federal Reserve has talked about is that they're going to be stopping their bond buying. So what that effectively means is the Federal Reserve is not going to be doing as much quantitative easing. They're not going to be putting more cash into the economy. So the money supply is either going to stop growing and stay static, or depending on the policy, the money supply may start to shrink a little bit. So what that's going to mean is that if we still have inflation, but there's less money in the economy, then fewer people are going to be able to afford those higher prices, which means that all of us are going to have to make difficult choices. Most of us are probably already making difficult choices, but the likelihood is that's going to continue to be the case. And that's going to mean less economic activity. And so that's going to reverberate through the economy over the next, year or two, if not longer. And so, it's going to affect every individual differently, but you can still prepare as if there's a reasonable likelihood that these things could happen, so that if they do happen, or when they do happen, you're in a position where you're not, behind the eight ball. You're not having to choose one thing or the other. It's not pleasant, but it's not going to substantially alter your, lifestyle choices or anything like that. So you just want to be ready. And I think that's good advice on the individual side, but what about the business side? I mean, these things that we're talking about also apply to business owners, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. From a business side, it's a little bit more intensified, I would say, because you're responsible for other people and their families. So you definitely want to have, 6 months expenses for your business, um, put away in a non-risky account where you can access any minute of any day. But you know, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? If you plan on making a capital expense, you need a fixed asset like a new vehicle or piece of equipment for your business, and you're going to need it in the next 12 months. You're probably better off going to get that right now before the rates go up. Businesses typically pay higher interest rates on equipment and fixed assets, non-vehicle stuff, I would say. Um, because typically the bank or the third party special financing company that does that kind of financing, they don't want the equipment. So they're 8%, 10%, 15%, depending on your credit. So I would definitely say go ahead and buy that equipment if you know you need it. And if you don't need it, I wouldn't buy it, but I would take this opportunity to shore up my balance sheet a little bit.
Yeah. Um, I think that definitely makes a difference. I mean, first of all, holding cash is a little bit different for a business, right? Because whereas if I'm looking at it from an individual perspective, if I suffer a devastating illness or injury, I might actually go to zero income personally. Now, that may not even be my household. Like if my spouse works or my partner works, there may still be household level income. But my income could go from here to zero in the blink of an eye. The odds of that happening to a business are a lot lower, right? I mean, unless there's some kind of, COVID lockdown again or something, and you're deemed a non-essential business, the odds are that you're not going to go to zero income. So your 6-month rainy day fund might actually last more than 6 months, depending on the downturn. But having that liquidity available is still really important because you don't want to make those tough choices of starting to lay people off or constrict certain parts of your business because you don't really have a choice in the matter. You want to be able to weather the storm and get through to the other side, and having that liquidity is crucial for that. You talked about financing capital assets. Are there any kind of debt obligations that you want to avoid right now? I mean, if you're a business owner, let's say you're involved in something that has a lot of inventory. I mean, are you trying to build your inventory up right now, or are you just sticking to, hard capital improvements in terms of like not inventory, but in terms of vehicles, in terms of equipment, stuff like that?
Well, and what I think you're trying to do with your vehicles in business is you're going to run them as long as you can, because you're going to want to put off, paying that increased value on a vehicle. But that's not always the smart choice in business, because there's a cost for holding the vehicle too long. Every time, if you're a business that has vehicles and people that drive to customers or clients' houses, when that vehicle goes down, your money machine goes down, right? So you got to weigh that. So you can't always put off a purchase. But on the other side, talking about inventory, if you can get inventory, I would highly recommend probably stocking up on your big movers, and that's all. I mean, don't get the things that don't move. As a matter of fact, I would highly recommend all businesses go through their entire inventory and probably thin it out a little bit, because you're probably going to find some SKUs that just don't move and you don't need to carry anymore. So I definitely recommend updating your inventory over these changes society's gone through the past couple of years. Our tastes have changed a little bit. So I would update what you keep in inventory, and I would try to stock a little bit more of the movers, the fast movers that you think are going to, when I say a little bit more, typically you might keep, a small business might keep 90 days if they're buying in bulk. Well, maybe you keep 6 months. I wouldn't keep a year or two. That's a little too far out, but I would suggest your high movers have a little bit higher inventory.
So it's a good time then to kind of reorganize and position yourself. I think that's important. I mean, if you look at it from the individual side, the likelihood is that you're going to have some difficult choices to make, right? You're not going to just be able to buy whatever you want whenever you want. So on the business side, I think that's wise advice, because if you've got a lot of stuff that's not moving really well anyway, the odds that it's going to suddenly start moving as people have to tighten the purse strings a little bit, it's not so good. You kind of want to bring things back to the basics and make sure that your fundamental revenue streams are locked in and solid. And, maybe if you were playing with some ideas that are kind of more conceptual in terms of revenue streams, maybe you want to tamp that back a little bit and focus on the bread and butter type items that are really making the business run. I think that's a good thing to think about right now. I mean, you always are trying to innovate, right? You're always trying to give a better product at a lower price. But this is one of the unfortunate realities of the economic circumstances that we're facing, is that that's not the kind of thing that is easy to do right now. It's a riskier proposition because the costs of borrowing are going up and liquidity is becoming more of an issue. So, you have to really think about what are the most important things and making sure that those things are buttoned up.
Yeah, definitely. In your personal life and in business, you can control, the two big things. You got income or revenue and expense. So in a time like this, over the past couple of years, if business was good, it's easy to see that expense side kind of get bloated a little bit, and you're spending a little bit more, maybe not paying as close attention as you used to, both personally and professionally. So take a look at that and nip out some stuff that you don't need and pay attention to the income side, because it's not going to be as easy to make more income when they tighten it up. Yeah. But I did want to add one thing, and this is going to be something to watch, whether it's a personal household or a business. Over the past 2 years, we've had a lot of people are calling it free money, right? The government's been giving a lot of money out. I'm not taking either side of that discussion, but I think we can all agree that there's been a lot of money being handed out in the past 2 years since COVID started. Well, that seems to be coming to an end. And really a number that I'm paying attention to that I think is really important, you and I have discussed this before, is the average debt level for the average household, right?
Right.
So for the first time in a long time, through the pandemic, we actually saw savings go up and debt levels go down. The weirdest thing, right? I mean, how in the world did that happen? We were apparently in a pandemic, but the average person had way less debt and way more savings. Very odd.
Right.
And
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
think you're right. Government tax credits and stuff like that, and stimulus payments and checks and stuff like that. I mean, that definitely made a difference. But then, you could argue that injecting all that cash into the economy contributed to the inflation that we're feeling now too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually just saw an article today that said that by summer 22, summer of this year, the expectation is that credit card balances are going to surpass their all-time highs in the United States. So it seems like things could be returning to the spend now, pay later type of mentality, right when this is not the time to be doing that.
Well, you're exactly right. And so that it's kind of ironic that the majority of the money that was being handed out ended in 2021. And we're already seeing reports less than 40 days into 2022
Yeah.
that the trend that's been happening for 2 years has reversed course. So we're already seeing reports now that savings are going down and they're being spent partially because of the inflationary prices, because of pumping the money in, right? So it's an interesting scenario we're in. And if people haven't already, they could possibly erode the savings they have built up. And now they're starting to use the credit card debts, like you said. So you will probably see the average credit card debt be higher than it ever was. I suspect the same thing's going to happen for student loans as well, because schools have not decided to cut their prices, even though you're not showing up there half the time anymore. So,
Well, I think the ultimate warning here is be cautious. There's just as much of a temptation, honestly. I mean, I feel the same temptation. It's like, oh, if I could go on, a super vacation, right? And, let's say there's a place I've always wanted to go, and I know that going there in a year or two is going to be way more expensive than it is right now. There's a huge incentive for me to go ahead and spend the money and go have that once in a lifetime experience right now. But I would advise be very, very cautious about that, because you might be better off having that money elsewhere. If you were going to take that vacation anyway, then you might think about it. But if you weren't, but there's this little part of you saying, well, yeah, I know you weren't planning on doing this until 5 or 10 years down the line, but man, you really need to do it now, because your dollar's never going to be worth more than it's worth right now.
Yeah.
That's a thought that people are having for sure.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thought you need to let pass. Just let it go. Because you don't need 10 or $15,000 less cash right now. You don't need 10 or $15,000 more credit card debt. The debt is especially daunting right now. And things like credit card debt, because most credit card debt is not fixed. That the interest rates are variable. So when you get to a point where your interest on a credit card purchase is going to go up with the interest rate increases, you could borrow now, but it's just like borrowing when the money's more expensive, because the cost of your borrowing is going to get more expensive with time. So don't do it. Just be very, very careful about that. If there's a way for you to get out of unsecured variable interest rate debt, get out of it. And if you're in a house right now with one of those adjustable rate mortgages, this is probably a good time to think about getting into something that's at a fixed rate and leave it be, because for interest rates potentially in 2022, it's going to be putting a hurting on your bottom line when it comes to your debt expenses. So got to be cautious about that.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on. And anybody that has any credit card debt or variable debt or any personal loans out there, unsecured, I would be attacking them right now, because if they're not fixed, the rates are going up, and that's personal and business. So, I mean, just to keep it simple, regardless if your personal business, clean up your balance sheet. Take this opportunity to clean up your personal balance sheet or your business balance sheet. We each have one. Everybody has one. And get rid of, look, what we're doing here, what we're talking about is limiting your exposure, right? Yeah, headwinds are coming. We don't know how bad. We don't know how good, but we know things are changing. So prepare yourself for it. If you have to make a large purchase, get that large purchase done now. You're going to save money in the long run. If you have variable rate, get rid of that before the rates go up, because it's going to change. I mean, you should get rid of it anyway in a good functioning society, but now you have a little bit more incentive to get rid of it.
Exactly. Well, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add?
I think that pretty much summed it up, because the balance sheet is really what's going to ultimately be important. Make sure you have as little going out as possible if something changes, and as much coming in. And on the personal grocery side or inventory side for the business, buy in bulk and save money, because that's the best way to reduce your cost, is by buying in bulk and not buying the things you really just don't need.
Yeah. Well, I agree. So I think with that, we're gonna call it a solid episode. And if you've been with us this entire time, we hope that something that we've talked about has been helpful to you. If you have any questions for us or any topics that you'd like us to talk about, anything you'd like to mention to us, please reach out. You can do that by sending us an email at the Purposeful Podcast at convergentdigitalmedia.com. If you are listening to us on your favorite podcast directory, please subscribe to this podcast. Leave us feedback if you can. It's very helpful. If you're watching us on YouTube or Rumble, please subscribe to our feeds there. We certainly appreciate you. We hope you are back with us next time. And we look forward to having you here at the Purposeful Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to join us on Locals at thepurposefulpodcast.locals.com, and find us on YouTube and Rumble by searching for the Purposeful Podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and review. This has been a production of Convergent Digital Media. Visit convergentdigitalmedia.com for more info. Thanks again for listening to the Purposeful Podcast.